Hey there.
Hey. Oh,
Sorry
do
about
we
that,
have,
Mark.
do we have a Terence sighting?
I'm here.
Oh, good.
Can you see me?
Yeah, I'm a little concerned because we're in the middle of a thunderstorm here, and sometimes the power goes out. So if that happens, continue without me, and 5 minutes later I'll rejoin because I'll have driven to the top of the hill where I can get LTE or
Okay. It's happened
cell service.
before. Don't worry. Anyways, many apologies for the delay. I'm actually using I never told you, but I'm actually doing an experiment where I'm resisting getting a smartphone, so I'm using a friend's phone.
Well, that's not smart.
Middle of a dinner party. Anyway, here we are.
So,
I'm in France. By the way. You're in upstate New York.
yes, and it's
Good to,
very late for you.
good to see you. It's not
And it's
that late.
very wet for me. Great to see you.
So we're also getting a lot of thunderstorms here in Burgundy at the moment as well.
Burgundy.
Anyway,
Well, I envy you. Why don't we just get started?
yeah, let's go for it. So we chatted a few days ago and went over some points of conversation, etc. And anyway, what we were going to talk a little bit. So let's talk about our first kind of encounter, and maybe your first encounter with the work, some of which is in the show in New York.
Yes. Well, first I wanted to set the stage because there probably are some people who don't know enough about you, and I thought it would be worth pointing out, or me for that matter, worth pointing out that you're a Vancouver artist with all that entails for a tradition of intellectual rigor and a really a strong tradition of serious interest in aesthetics, in all things beautiful.
Right.
And that goes back not just 100 years, but thousands of years in the region we now call British Columbia. So you come from a very rich place that has east-west connections. Vancouver is a very Asian city. And many Vancouver artists have got dealers in Europe. So there's a real kind of east-west thing going on in Vancouver. But you chose to go south. Maybe you can tell us why you went south.
Well, I went east briefly. Actually, it's interesting because my mentor and my professor I was most connected to at art school was Ian Wallace, who's kind of the godfather of photoconceptualism in Vancouver. And I think that was very much my formation. I was never really a photographer, but I do have some, a number of pieces. One work that's in the show, actually, one series of photos in the show that very much come out of that Vancouver formation. And then right after art school, I went to Europe, actually, because that's, as you say, exactly, a lot of the artists from, that I was looking up to in Vancouver were working mostly in Europe. They weren't really working in the US at all. It was much more of a kind of straight to Europe trajectory from whether it's Germany or Paris or wherever, or Spain. And so I spent a year in Cologne in Germany right after art school and then moved back to Vancouver. And that's when I decided to move to Mexico. That's when that whole Mexican, with that whole, part of my life and my work in Mexico started in 1993.
What was the attraction to Mexico? I mean, it's unusual for your background.
So it's funny because it's something we talked about this a little bit. And I actually wrote this long text last year during the pandemic, during the
which I read and loved, by the way.
Exactly, while I was stuck at home for months on end. It's really about my whole history of Mexico, my first ideas of Mexico, my first encounters of Mexico, and some of it comes from, a lot of it comes from actually my father going to Mexico a lot in the 1970s and coming back to Canada with a lot of artifacts and artisania and things like that, and going down to look at the architecture. He was an architect. Finally, in the 90s, actually in the late 80s, my mother moved to Mexico, at least for kind of half the year, like a lot of Northerners and like a lot of Canadians. And I went down to visit her, and I ended up staying. I ended up realizing that I needed to be in Mexico City and stay there and live there. And that's really when it all started. It was like late 93, and then it was really, immediately fell in love with the city, flew back to Canada, sold everything, packed everything up, and moved to Mexico City and lived there until the mid-90s, and then I started living kind of between New York and Mexico City. So that was the impetus at the time. It was actually an invitation from my mother, basically, to come down.
Great. Turned out great for you, because I remember seeing the large exhibition of your work. It was a solo show at the Laboratorio right downtown Mexico, sort of diagonally across from the Bellas Artes Museum. And that really surprised me. First of all, I thought it was an architecture exhibition. And then it slowly sunk in that this was not the work of an architect, but of a visual artist who uses architecture and the language of design as his subject matter. And I'm really glad that I saw it because, you know, I've been following your career ever since. I was, first of all, stunned to see Canadian art of this quality in Mexico City. And not that you don't see a lot of wonderful work in Mexico City, but you don't see a lot of Canadian art. And particularly a Canadian who's interested in Mexico as a subject. And now I want to ask you, you're the son of an architect, so architecture is kind of in your genes. But modernism, or what I prefer to call formalism, because I think modernism has now become such a bizarre word, with this bizarre notion of us being post-present. There's a big difference between the modernist architecture in the impetus, let's say, in Mexico and in Canada and in other countries. It has a different genesis and a different history. Was that interesting to you?
Yeah, and I would say that was the first attraction. Actually, before, I want to just make a little parenthesis. So Marc was in Mexico, so you were for museum directors conference kind of thing.
Yes.
Were you director of, so Marc was director of National Gallery in Canada for many years. Were you then at the National, or?
No, I was at the Musée Contemporain at that time.
In Montreal.
In Montreal. This was 2005, I would think, right?
Okay, exactly. It was 2005.
Yeah, so I was the director of the Musée Contemporain in Montreal when I was there. That was my second trip to Mexico. I had also been to Mexico City, I should say. I've not been anywhere else but Mexico City. In Puebla, I went through once. When I was at the Brooklyn Museum.
Okay.
And that was a very interesting trip. So I can very easally see how a Canadian or anyone could fall in love with Mexico. It's incredibly rich in culture, in pleasure, in a great climate. The people are absolutely magnificent, wonderful, wonderful evening. So I can see how you could kind of not want to leave. But I'm very curious about this this notion of the difference between the modernist tradition in a place like Mexico, where it has a different genesis. In Canada, it's much more the private sector that drove modernism. But in Mexico, it was the state. Was it you that brought up this question of this issue of state activism, which I think is a really interesting term? Yeah, that's I've written about a number of times. So you're asking about what was the attraction for, you know, as far as in how I started working with modernism in Mexico. For me, it was exactly that. I mean, it was actually arriving in Mexico City, and mostly, of course, it was, you know, I had been living in, or visiting and falling in love with places like Rome and Cairo, and these cities with kind of layers and layers of civilization going back to kind of like, you know, pre-modern times. And I was interested in in Mexico. Sorry, my other phone's ringing. Don't take that call.
No, I'm not. It had the same kind of layers, and you know, going back to kind of pre-Columbian history, you went to the metro, and there'd be like a excavation of a pyramid there, kind of thing, as you know what I'm talking about. And at the same time, I was finding this incredible density of what I call the modern project. So it was very much manifest in Mexico, and much more thoroughly than I'd ever seen in other parts of North America. I hadn't seen that in the US, and I hadn't seen that in Canada. So I'd seen it, you know, this kind of modern project, this idea of kind of ordering the city and kind of advancing the city and you know, redesigning the urbanism and all these kind of things, housing, all these kinds of things had advanced so much further, and it'd been such a much larger project in Mexico than I'd seen in the rest of North America. I'd maybe seen a little bit in Europe. And that was interesting to me, just, you know, to see that on the same continent, to see that things had advanced much further in a way, you know, in the 1950s and 60s in Mexico than we're familiar with in Canada. I mean, we started, as we were talking about earlier, I mean, modernizing in the 20s. You're from a town that was very much, you know, built according to a modern format in Western Ontario in the 1920s and 30s. But but there you were seeing a kind of a kind of total redesign of the city. You know, it was semi-successful. It was successful in some parts and others no. So grand design on the scale of kind of Le Corbusier, Plan Voisin kind of idea, like a much grander scale than I've ever seen in North America. So that was instantly something that I wanted to look at and to think about. And it was, it took me a number of years before I started actually working on that as a subject. Wasn't until probably the early 2000s. So a good like 7 or 8 years, I was working on other parts of other kind of observations of Mexico City before that. A number of those that appear in the exhibition as well in New York.
We tend to talk about modernism as in architecture and in urban design, particularly as a failed utopian project, which I think is a little harsh. I don't actually think that's entirely true. But how successful was this transformation of Mexico City? Did a lot of it work? I mean, we're talking about raising the quality of life for an awful lot of people at the cost of bulldozing their neighborhoods so that they could live in a modern house, a modern housing complex. You don't use a lot of mockery, or there is an element of satire in your work, but you're not literally making fun of any of this. You're looking at this much more, not so much sympathy as a kind of a scientific just facts approach. Although there is a certain amount of humor, but it's not a humor that it denigrates either Mexican modernism, certainly not, or modernist architecture in general. You have this ambivalent relationship with it. Is that because your father was a card-carrying modernist, So
it's there are a lot of things there. So first of all, failed utopias. You know, I think all utopias are failed utopias. Utopia is actually something that is unattainable, of course.
Sure.
So all of this talk about like modernism as failed utopia is kind of I've even participated in these exhibitions that are all about the kind of failures. There's a kind of connection. There's kind of a triangle between the failure utopia and modernism that I don't really subscribe to. In the case of Mexico City, so one of the things, and I've talked about this a lot before, and is one of my main observations coming from Canada and from a less, I guess you could say, class-based society. In Canada, of course, we have classes. Things are actually divided more along terms of race, probably in Canada than anything. I was seeing like a heavily kind of like class divided society. You know, there's a lot more integration being a Latin American country as well. There's a lot less sense of kind of apartheid like we have in Canada. I'm exaggerating a little bit there, but so modernism was manifest in different ways from what I observed in Mexico, you know, depending on where you are in the kind of class division. There was a kind of elite modernism, which is something I worked with a lot as well. This is, my work with the architect Barragan was, he was actually working mostly for the elite in Mexico. And then there's a kind of public modernism. I think that's what you're talking about. It was adapted very much by the state very early, really just post-revolution, or we're already talking about in the 30s, 40s. Much earlier than the US and Canada, really, as a kind of official style, partly for practical reasons, partly because it was for symbolic reasons, because it was about kind of restarting and restarting the state with a kind of new kind of built language, in a way, building language. So I think that's kind of what you're referring to, and I think that was much more manifest in Mexico, and it was manifest on a much larger scale than we saw in the other parts of North America. What I was observing was there was this moment of, and this is what I was expressing in the exhibition you saw in 2005-06, it was this moment in the 1950s and 60s of kind of enormous progress. There was a sense of enormous optimism as well. There was a sense that Mexico was emerging from the third world, and I think the symbolism of the Olympics in the late 60s, of course, was part of this. We're going to join the rest of North America as a kind of first world country. We're fully modernized, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, a number of things happened. There was because, of course, the city of Mexico was so attractive and so, it was a kind of draw for people. There was this enormous population explosion that happened in Mexico City. And this created more kind of housing problems. It was more, when it seemed like, you know, the infrastructure was going to kind of master all these problems of schools and housing and hospitals, et cetera, suddenly this huge wave of people arrived from the country. And it was a very difficult thing to kind of plan for. And so the planning started falling apart, and then there was the issue of the Olympics, and then all sorts of government corruption came out, and then one thing led to another. And of course, we ended up with the, you know, with the massacre, the student massacre leading up to the Mexican Olympics, and then the onward and onward in the 70s, of course, with you know, with different crises. So we're, you know, 50s and 60s were this kind of golden moment of progress and optimism, and that's kind of that's very much what I focused on in that work, and something that we'd never really experienced, I don't think, in other parts of North America, at least not at that scale. So that was fascinating for me.
Yeah, I think that's right. They experienced it in Europe, certainly in Germany.
Yeah,
they had cities to rebuild, etc.
In France, you had the Trente Glorieuses, and I think there was a similar feel, a post-war moment.
Right. I don't think a lot of French people find the architecture from that period very glorious, but
no, there's a similar problem. Yeah.
A lot of it hasn't aged well, and if you go to a city like Dresden, you'll see what quick and dirty looks like in architecture.
Exactly.
A city that is like a cookie cutter. In fact, it reminds me a little bit of a piece in your show. By the way, I have to congratulate you on this show, and I want to encourage everybody who's listening, who's in the New York area, to go and see it at the American Society, 680 Park Avenue. Definitely worthwhile. It's a beautiful show. It's a bit of a is palimpsest the right word? I mean, you've got this Alfredo Siqueiros exhibition that you've overlaid your exhibition on top of, these ghost images.
You can see it in this image right now, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, there you can see some of the pictures in the background, which I thought was really beautiful, because you really respect the heritage of the places, and you're very interested that where you're showing is a subject is integrated in what you're actually making art about. The Barragan work with the red wall is got to be one of my all-time favorite works of yours. It's a giant red wall, and I'm new to the diversity of reds, by the way. And this is a red that I find very beautiful. The new aesthete that I am finds that red very, very beautiful. But there's a black and white photograph of a very famous building by Barragan. And
his own house, in fact, yeah, his
famous house.
Yeah.
But so I mean, I know why it's in black and white, but I want you to tell everybody who's listening why it's in black and white, and on this red, this vivid, almost crushed tomato red color.
Yeah. So what you were seeing in the image actually above right now is
that's right.
First of all, you're seeing this kind of superimposition that we did of this. What I did is I remounted a show that occurred in the same space in 1970 by Siqueiros, the Mexican muralist. It was kind of a show that occurred very late in his life and his career, and it was a show of easel paintings of his, and it was kind of his big retrospective in New York in a way. And so that's presented in a kind of facsimile form as a background in a way for my work, but as a kind of support, as a kind of reference that runs all through the space. So as a way of kind of talking about the institutional memory of the space itself, talking about this kind of triangulating my practice in Mexico with this space, with and with, of course, me coming from Canada. The work that Marc's talking about on the left that you see in the image is called the Red Wall (parentheses Barragan), and of course, those who don't know, Barragan, of course, is one of probably the best known modern architect from Mexico, even though he probably built the least in a way. He didn't do a huge amount of work, at least in this mature phase that the house is from. The Barragan was very effective in promoting his work. His public relations mechanism was very developed, and he was very quite early in his career already sending out material to architecture magazines all around the world and publishing all over the place. He was well known in Italy already in the 40s, and it was interesting because back then in architecture magazines everything was published in black and white. And so people would have had their first encounter with his work, at least internationally, with this kind of tonal, planar experience of the work. Of course, now when we go and visit a Barragan building, what he's famous for, now that we've seen all the photographs published in color, is this integration of color into his work. It's this kind of, he borrowed the term emotional architecture from Matthias Geritz, who I've worked on a lot as well.
Wonderful sculptor.
To kind of talk about this idea of kind of generating emotion with the work. So I basically give you two experiences about organza work. The piece is designed so that it's this black and white photo that hangs on this huge red wall. So it's the largest wall you can find in the exhibition space. Needs to be painted this kind of saturated cadmium red, I guess is what you'd call it. That's how the piece is installed.
I mean, no one comes away from visiting that house without having their preconceived ideas about color and the power of color over our organism kind of transformed. He's the colorist of modernist architecture.
It's true, yeah.
And
he's
represent them in black and white.
Their architects, yeah.
Is pretty clever. Another work that I really loved, and my Aztec is a little rusty, so I'm going to let you give us the title, and that is these cardboard boxes of different sizes that represent a housing complex.
So, there's a shot. There's a good shot of the table. Thank you, Natalia. And so, first of all, the exhibition is kind of, as you see, there are some wall works, there's some kind of major wall installations, mostly layered over these siqueiros, facsimiles. And then the centerpiece of the show is this huge table with a lot of works exhibited on the table, and a lot of vitrines and models. And the idea was to create a kind of urbanism of the exhibition, of this sort of mini retrospective, almost like a Wunderkammer, almost, or like a like a boîte en valise, like the Duchamp. Exactly. So one of the pieces that's presented on the table is actually a new presentation of a piece that was originally done and shown in New York for a show at the New Museum. And this is a series of infinitely reproducible models, kind of scale reproductions of the four principal building types of the Tlatelolco housing complex in Mexico City. Tlatelolco, and this is one of the major projects that I was really referencing earlier when I was talking about these kind of large infrastructure projects. Was when it was built. I think it was the largest housing complex built in Latin America at that point. It was so vast. I mean, I love the story that I mean, I don't know if it's true, but I think Mario Pani, the chief architect, he talks about this in one of his interviews, that when the French architecture magazine approached him, Architecture d'aujourd'hui, they did two monographs actually on Mexico. In the early 60s, they approached him and said, like, what are your latest projects? And he sent them a photo of Tlatelolco, and they said, we don't publish maquettes. He said, no, this is actually built. This is actually a built project. It's like, this isn't just like a Le Point Voisin fantasy. Right. Kind of. This was actually built in Mexico City. So it was so vast that people actually didn't believe it was built. My project is kind of, the idea is these are kind of ultimately, intimately, or infinitely reproducible copies of the Pani buildings, and you could kind of create Tlatelolco at any scale you want. So we could go much larger if you wanted and turn it into kind of like a wallpaper almost that kind of covers, or a carpet that just covers the landscape. Terrifying in some ways, but in a way it's kind of this kind of fantasy maybe of certain modern planners. Sorry, and just quickly, the facade design, one of the ideas of the project also is a kind of homage to the original designs of the facades, which have been, the building was, the complex was badly damaged in the 1995 earthquake, and the facades were largely covered up by sort of buttressing and modifications that happened at that point. So I'm kind of representing the original facade designs, which are very beautiful. I find that fascinating because, of course, you and I are both big believers in biography having a role in culture. Biography of the cultural actress, for example. When I was a kid, my father was a liquor salesman, and just before Christmas, us kids would have the job to make the gift boxes. He would get these flats. It would be sent from the company from Toronto, and then we would spend days and days, my brother, my sister, and I, making these gift boxes, and then we could play with them for a few days before he started using them to fill them with liquor bottles. And we would make these environments, but they have the exact same dimensions as Tlatelolco boxes. If people can see, they look like a maquette from here, but in actuality, they are boxes that you can put together. And when I was looking at that, I had a Proustian moment thinking about those boxes that I used to make when I was a kid, but also
had a lot of fun making environments with those boxes. But this, I imagine a child would get very bored trying to find, it's not an erector set. There's not a lot of creativity that is there for the person who's moving these things around. They kind of beg to have a rectilinear relationship.
Well, that is a creative. It's like the arrangement of the boxes. It's like, it's the arrangement. And actually there's a print that's part of the project, which is a kind of example of how the boxes could be arranged kind of infinitum in a way, in an installation. Actually, Mark, you just reminded me, actually, when we were kids, when we get cardboard boxes in the house, we would actually turn them into, we'd cut holes and things and make windows and turn them into buildings, and then we would light them on fire. We'd make them into like burning buildings. That was one of our main kind of like things that we did for fun, was do these incredibly elaborate kind of, and they were carefully designed so they burn in a certain way.
Were there any girls in your family besides your mother?
3 boys and 1 girl. Imagine.
Okay. All right. Yeah. So the girl was outnumbered, so she didn't get a vote on whether or not to burn down the nice house that you just
she was in that. She was involved as well, for sure. Yeah.
That's great. Now you've also covered in your work, although this show at the American Society is really about your Mexican work, which I think is the bulk of your career, if I'm not mistaken. But
it's a huge chunk. Yeah.
Yeah. You've done work surrounding other architectural projects in history, notably Hirshhorn, Ontario, which
exactly.
is a particularly fascinating story. And you did that for the Hirshhorn Museum, didn't you, in New York?
So this is interesting because, as I mentioned, I started, in 93, I arrived, I lived in Mexico City full time for 2 years, and then I've been, from 95, I moved to New York with my partner, and we kind of lived between New York and Mexico City since then. And I've continued, exhibiting and living and working consistently in Mexico as more kind of part-time. And I'm just looking at some of the messages here. And then what I think that show in 2005 and 6 that you saw was a kind of jumping off point in me for a way. Like, I think I concluded a lot of this kind of body of work and this kind of long observation and deep research, I think, on modern architecture and the development of modern architecture and the manifestation of it in Mexico. And then I took that kind of that mode of working, in a way, that methodology, and started applying to other places and taking it to other parts of the world. I started receiving more invitations to obviously show and do research and do residencies and things in other places. For instance, I did a long residency in Sweden some years ago, where I did a big study of the public housing in Sweden, and one of those places, of course, was the U.S., where I was working at the time. It was, living part-time as well in New York. So housing in New York, I did a big project. I did a project on public schools in New York, and then I became interested in other public institutions. It was specifically public architecture I was interested in, and one of them, of course, was museums. And so when I was invited by the Hirshhorn to do a show, it came kind of at the same time as an invitation from the Smithsonian to come down and be a research resident at the Smithsonian Institution, and started this big body of research that resulted in many different projects. But one of them was a show at the Hirshhorn, and it was about, it was the same situation. It's like, go in, okay, I want to do some research. I want to spend a few months and just really go into the archives, and this is how a lot of my projects develop. In that case, it was working with the history of the institution itself, of the museum itself. And in this case, I discovered that, of course, Hirshhorn, the founder of the museum, who donated his collection, had all these Canadian interests. So there was this interesting kind of Canadian-U.S. connection, and that he actually decided to build a kind of utopian town in Canada. So the project ended up being about that. The town was supposed to be designed by Philip Johnson, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, and that developed into this large installation and video, et cetera, et cetera. So, so that's I would say that's a methodology that I really developed, from that body of work in Mexico, which was very formative for me, very formative for how I ended up working after that.
That was a sad story. Just before he died, I asked my father about Hirshhorn, Ontario, and he remembered it. He said, oh yeah, I remember the controversy. And he said the reason it was never built, and this was, Philip Johnson.
Oh, because it was in the neighborhood of where you grew up, exactly.
Yeah, I'm from Sudbury. And
Yeah.
my father said the local politicians did not want to extend services to a new town.
That's exactly what it was. Yeah.
And so he took his toys and he went to Washington, and the Hershey Museum and that wonderful collection would have been in Northern Ontario. So thanks a lot, politicians. From
Exactly. The Hershey Museum was planned for the middle of that town, designed by Philip Johnson, and it was a local politician. Basically, he was like, fronting all this money to build this town. It was like he was told it was going to be $30 million, and then suddenly it was more, and then suddenly he was starting to get resistance. He was getting resistance from other towns around there as well, because it was, this is not many people know, but there was a kind of gold rush occurring in Western Ontario, and it was a uranium rush. So we're talking about the height of the arms race, the Cold War. There was an enormous demand for uranium. All of it was going to the Pentagon, of course.
Elliott Lake.
And directly through the Canadian government, et cetera. And so this was a big narrative of my project as well. And he was getting resistance from neighboring towns as well, who didn't want basically this competition. So it was a political thing. It was a commercial thing as well. And he finally just kind of, he started to see what the bill was going to be as well. So there were a number of factors that made him just kind of cancel the town, but it existed on paper, which was interesting. So we rebuilt it digitally, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, thank you for reviving that as an art project, because I would never have known about it had it not been for your piece.
Yeah.
And I was grateful that I could just get in there before he died to ask my dad, whatever happened to this wonderful mini Brasilia we were going to have here in Northern Ontario, of all unlikely places. But yet again, the difference between modernism in Canada and modernism in Mexico. In fact, a brand new model modernist city, and if it was Philip Johnson in that period, it would have been very Miesian. Would have been.
It was his Miesian phase in the 50s, early 50s. We're talking. Yeah, exactly.
It's the private sector tries to modernize us, and but the public sector says no. Just the opposite in Mexico. Fascinating.
Yeah. So one thing, maybe we didn't talk about this before, but one of the reasons I was attracted to the modern project in Mexico and this idea of these kind of vast schemes is I kind of grew up. I don't know if I told you this before, but my father was, of course, a modern architect in Western Canada. I grew up in a town of about 20,000 people, and he was I guess probably the main architect in the town. I mean, he did a lot of municipal buildings. Churches, schools, the ski hill, all these different things, the houses of all of our house, all of our friends, who of course were his clients. And so I grew up very much within his project. It was his concept of the family, of the city, of the urbanism, of the region. And I really grew up kind of within this one person's concept. It was really this kind of Le Corbusian moment in a way, my childhood, my growing up. And I think that's why I've always been interested in this. And I think that was it was interesting to see, this kind of manifest in Mexico at such a scale. And I think maybe that's why this idea of kind of planning, and it was interesting coming out of a Canadian context, because I think we have, as you're saying, you're from Sudbury, and I think that was one of the planned cities of Canada, often built around resource extraction. I mean, north of where I grew up, there was a town called Kitimat, and I studied that actually a lot for the Hershey project. Kitimat was a town planned and built in the early 50s with a lot of kind of new urbanism ideas from like Clarence Stein and these different people. And I think I grew up with these kind of things in the air, and I think it was always very interesting. Yes, this idea of like a totally planned environment. Then you go to this city with like these layers of cultures and civilizations and this complete chaos kind of thing, and you see this attempt at planning that's like so extensive and so deep that it was incredible to kind of see that in that place at such a scale. So that was, once again, I mean, that was kind of what drew me there, and it's been kind of an endless mine of material and interest for me as an artist.
I find this quite surprising to hear that Sudbury would have been a planned community, because growing up there, you don't have a sense of any logic in the urban planning in Sudbury. Now, when you touched on your father and that you were actually immersed within an architectural project,
Yeah.
I don't want to get too personal, but I've heard from wives of architects, for example, who are not allowed to choose the flowers, not allowed to choose their own dresses because
That's my mother.
part of the architecture. Is that something that you had to put up with as a kid? Did you have to match the architecture?
Totally. Yeah. And I had my, those are exactly the complaints of my mother. She's like, I just wanted 2 things in that house and he didn't give them to me, kind of thing. Oh. I won't tell you what they were, but anyway, there was definitely this idea of control. That I think is manifest in all 4 of us siblings. I think he's had a huge influence on that as well. For me, it was, it was my formation. It was my childhood. So it was kind of, it's all I knew in a way. So I think going out and discovering the world is a much more kind of chaotic place, and it's unplanned, and these kind of things has been interesting.
And layers of history. I mean, there are thousands of years of Ojibwe, Anishinaabe history in Sudbury, where I came from.
Yeah.
And you're aware of it because the reservations are not far, and there were a lot of people living off reservations. In fact, I had many neighbors were Ojibwe growing up. So that tradition is very present. However, modern. Sudbury was founded in 1927. It's a relatively new city. So when they talked about urban renewal when I was a kid, now when I look back at it, I find it really funny. The concept of urban renewal for a city that, is new, essentially. What are they're wiping out the 40s and 50s and replacing it with the 60s and 70s.
Yeah.
The power of architects, though, this is the way that our world looks, is very much determined to a large extent, probably not anywhere near as much as they would like to, but very much the ideology, the ideas, certainly, of architects. It must be, you're not the first person I know whose father was an architect. And it's clearly very influential in your work. But one thing that I find fascinating, your work is not so much, it's kind of off the side. It's not so much about architecture, but about it generically as a form of speech, as a form of political speech, aesthetic speech, but speech. An architect is a public intellectual, necessarily, because the buildings are in public. Does that sound right to your project? Well, I think this is something we've also talked about before. I think this idea of speech, and I think of architecture speaking in a way, I think it's something I've worked with a lot, and I think it's really at the root of my work on architecture. By the way, I don't just work on architecture, but for instance, the Siqueiros installation is an example of other subject work I work with. But I think the core of the Mexican project for me has really been about the architecture. This idea of speech and writing, I think, is absolutely essential to me, and I think that's one of the things you see it. I did a recent project and showed it in New York on about architecture of Tel Aviv from the 1930s. Wonderful show. I kind of break down into a kind of a language in a way, into a kind of syntax, or I guess a vocabulary. It's like I look at it really as a built language. So these forms, these building forms, actually kind of represent things, and what they represent are, this belief in the kind of the new culture and the new country and the new society, et cetera, et cetera. And so when you look at those things that are 80, 90 years later, I think they still embody those things, and I think they still speak that, they still actually have that message built into them. And this is kind of what I was communicating, I think, with the work on Mexico from the 1950s and 60s, and that's what the public that went to see that exhibition, for instance, that you went to see in 2005, that was the response I was getting. It's like this kind of architectural language, this kind of building language actually represents something. It actually sort of says something. And so this is an idea that I've been working with ever since, so that the abstract form of modern architecture can kind of be a language in a way, and actually can deliver a message. So for instance, this whole series of projects I've been doing about embassy design, U.S. embassy design around the world, that's very much about this building is built to kind of deliver a message to the country where it is built. We're a young country, and we're kind of like freedom of information and all these ideas is kind of manifest in the architecture, and the architectural language is used to express that. And that's always been interesting to me, because modern architecture is an abstract idiom in a way.
it's a series of prismatic forms and kind of abstract forms, and I was interested in that it becomes representational in a way, even the work of Barragán.
However, the one thing that I liked that stayed with me in the Marissa Newman Gallery show that you did with the Tel Aviv forms, it's kind of an alphabet of possible forms, is really the negotiation between what we need a building to be. There needs to be fenestration, there needs to be doors, there needs to be room for services, etc. And the negotiation with design and how these things are imposing on each other in a way. And you've given a set of possibilities for a simple house and what it can look like, given this sensibility, this reductivist style, that's like an alphabet. It really was. And so that's a point that I want to raise about the use of humor in your work, because that show, yes, there's an element of humor, yes, there's an element of satire, but you never go too far. You hold back to the point where it becomes information that you're imparting, not only the information or the speech of the architect and the needs of the client, but also the speech of the artist who's making art about this negotiation, which I think is very sophisticated, Terence. I really do enjoy your work an awful lot because of that very subtle relationship with humor. You're not really interested in having a big laugh or a big guffaw, but there's plenty of humor, but it's not available to everybody unless it's available to people who know a lot about architecture and urban planning and the needs of a home, etc.
It's like that serious, not serious divide that I talked about. I think I talked about my last chat with Monica Latorre. But you just mentioned something that's interesting. I think with the Tel Aviv project, is very much about, so we're talking about functionalism, which is just pure function. It's like we design these things so that they function, and you have the bathroom here and you have the window and et cetera, et cetera. Versus this other, moving into an area of like where you want to express something else beyond just the pure function. Of course, that was the tension in pre-war modernism, I think, or in pre-war modern architecture was where does that end? And there's a lot of criticism of that architecture because it became kind of stylistic. It wasn't just about kind of satisfying this kind of functional program. It was much more. It kind of moved into this more expressive place, I think. And I think this is something we see. Obviously, you see it in the work of Le Corbusier. You see it, of course, in Mexico. You see that progression as well in the architecture and I think it was very much manifest, and that was interesting to me in Tel Aviv, in their so-called Bauhaus style architecture, because it's this kind of like almost like a symbolic style in a way that was used there. And some people would call it functionalist, but it wasn't really, because it was moving into this other place. So anyway, that was, I just wanted to mention that I can't really say humor in the work. I think as I mentioned before, I think I think it's important. I think it kind of introduces kind of pleasure into the process of the production of the work, and also the experience of the work. To have a subtle humor there, I think it kind of the function of humor also kind of breaks things a little bit. It kind of like disorients you maybe a little bit as well. So you'll suddenly see things from a slightly different angle. It's a slightly disorienting experience, so that you'll kind of readdress things, hopefully as a viewer as well.
There's a disenchantment function too.
Yeah, very much so. With humor also, you're able to say things that it's absolutely Freud's theory of humor, that come out of the unconscious that you wouldn't say normally. These are the different functions of humor that we're talking about. And I think I mentioned before that like my model is really probably Nabokov, which is this kind of incredibly kind of subtle, discrete kind of inserted humor. There's all sorts of kind of innuendo, which I love. There's always a sense of thinking something might be kind of louche or unsavory, but there's so things are always kind of the seriousness of things are also always kind of being kind of called down in a way. And I think
you kind of remind me a little bit of it's funny you should bring up Nabokov, because he was a Russian polyglot who was living outside of Russia and commenting on the modern world that he and manners and mores, etc. And it's a little bit what you're doing with Mexico and with other places, but not exactly, because you're your humor is slightly different. I'm dying to see the project. How long is it going to take you to finish this project, American Embassies? Because I got lots to say on embassy architecture. I lived for 10 years in Ottawa, and there are a lot of embassies there, and kind of non-embassies. People just buy an old house and turn it into an embassy. And then there are these very deliberately, symbolically built buildings that are about being a neighbor also.
Yeah.
I think the United States really felt that the new embassy that they were building, because it matched so well formalistically with the National Gallery that it abuts diagonally.
This monstrosity.
The terrorist attack in Oklahoma City put paid to that lovely idea, and it became essentially a model for the USS Monitor. It looks like a submarine instead of a beautiful glass building with friendly winks. But also, it's not the first U.S. embassy in Ottawa. There was the one that was slated to become the National Portrait Gallery. And you have a sense
the Catskills building from the late 1920s. Yeah, so that was the first.
I didn't realize
Catskills. Yeah, it's true.
So the Woolworth building, Catskills.
Yeah. No, he's that beautiful warehouse in Williamsburg, and that's all Catskills. He's a brilliant architect from 20s and 30s in New York.
So we're looking at it's directly across the street from the Parliament of Canada, which is a great Victorian neo-Gothic pile. It's dark, it's looming, it's frightening, and they put this tiny, elegant, pretty, feminine, French, like extremely French Beaux-Arts pastiche of French Baroque, which is essentially a white and gold version of Renaissance architecture, because the French.
So Marc is describing the U.S. embassy, the 20s embassy in Ottawa.
That's right. That's the one I'm talking about. It's almost as if it's mocking this great Victorian pile across the way, using French architecture. Anyway, all that stuff. How a state can speak through the architecture of its embassy. So all of this to say that I'm waiting with bated breath for this new project of yours. When is it going to be ready for prime time?
So I'm working. Actually, I was working on that today. So it's a project about a U.S. embassy. So we have the 1929 embassy and the 1999 embassy by David Charles, the big kind of submarine. And there was a 1959 project that was announced and commissioned but never built in Ottawa. So my whole project is really about this new project I'm working on. I'm really just starting seriously on that now. Is about this, what I call the lost embassy. Is the embassy we don't have plans for. We know who was building it. We know the architect, and we know his contemporary work for the period. And but the building was never actually built. So it's a lot of speculation. It's actually quite a funny project as well about looking at other buildings of his as models for this particular embassy that was never built. So that will be hopefully done next year. Yeah, you'll hear about it.
Wow, that's a long time to wait. But I'm very excited about it. We've got 2 or 3 minutes left. I want to make sure that we covered all the things that you wanted to talk about.
And then we get cut off. It's true. I think we're This is let me think. Modernism in Canada. I want to actually, Marc, very quickly I love your story about your uncle who was obsessed with Mexico. I mean, we talked about my first encounter with Mexico. Now your first encounter with Mexico.
Well, if I'm an art historian, and if I'm also a failed artist, it's because of my uncle Rayo, who had an Army Navy surplus store. And he had an art gallery in the basement of his Army Navy surplus store in Sudbury. And he made one trip in his life. He was a fairly successful businessman in Sudbury. I mean, he lived well, and he spent. He used to tell me that he spent about $30,000 a year on art, and he bought an awful lot of Woodland School.
And we're talking like 1960s, no? That's a lot.
Yes, we're talking about the 60s. He was a Sunday painter, wonderful man, bought me art supplies, encouraged my interest in art. He was my only relative who liked art, and he was very, very close with my father, so there was that. But he made one trip in his whole life. And it was to Mexico. He never went anywhere else, never went to Europe. My aunt has never been to Europe. They had the means, but they just weren't into traveling. They built a very nice house, and they loved to stay in it. But an awful lot of what was in that house was from Mexico, and things that he brought back on this life change. I don't know how many people I have met whose lives were changed by visit to Mexico.
He must have brought
was
like
the
a
first
container.
one, but I've met others. There's you.
Yeah.
And I'm, you know, there's something in the water in Mexico. It's a very, very special place in the world for sure. I have nothing but love for it. But my uncle, that was his one big adventure. So his two passions were Mexico and art, particularly modern art.
Yeah.
And of course, his father's business that he inherited, which was Army Navy surplus, which paid the bills. So yeah, that's the story.
So great. I love it. So similar. Anyway, good to talk to you.
Great seeing you again.
Good to see you. I'll see you in a couple of months back in New York.
Yes, I hope so. And seeing what time it is over there, sleep well.
Yeah, thank you, American Society, for setting this up. Good to see you, Marc.
Wonderful show, American Society. Thank you too.
Take care.